Greetings. I just wanted to come out with another quick video to note an interesting detail in the history of One West Israelite groups. So I'm going to play a roughly 7-minute clip of a class which was taught at the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ well over a decade ago on the topic of the 7 seals in the book of Revelation. I'll occasionally add subtitles to highlight portions I find interesting, and then I'll offer some brief comments after the clip finishes. So here we go.
I'm going to just say this. I got to tell y'all this. The 7th seal actually talks about, when the 7 seals is open, it talks about Abba Bivens, and it talks about We're going to give you a little bit. Just going to give you just a little bit. I want to put that out there and not say nothing behind it. Okay, listen. Okay, give me the 5th verse and let's read that again.
Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
Okay, this is a true saying. It has come and it has been executed and it has come to pass. That is the guy that came, the man of God that came, that actually set up what is now being called the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ. Do everybody understand that? He was known as Abba Bivens. And he was the one that was out there telling black people and Hispanic people that they were the children of Israel. Do everybody understand that? And that they had to come back and they had to follow God. This was his sole purpose. His sole purpose was to tell them that they were the Israelites, and that's it. And they had to come back and follow God. When you research and you listen to some of the tapes of Abba Bivens' teaching, he was very clear in his teaching. All he did was read the scriptures and tell Israel that they were Israelites. That was it.
Mercy shall come upon you, and shall pursue you, and overtake you. They will pursue you, nobody else, and overtake you, all right? Shall thou be destroyed, all right? You know, thou hearken not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, for if thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord your God, to keep his commandments, and his statutes, which he commanded you, and they shall be upon you. All these curses are going to be on you for a sign. The sign is that you're an Israelite.
And that was all that he was supposed to do. Do everybody understand that? Read the 5th verse and the 6th verse again.
Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet.
And this is also the same man that Bar Mitzvah, high priest Ahrayah, into the truth when he was 12 years old. Everybody understand what I'm saying? For everybody that don't believe, brother, don't believe. Just stand back and watch. Because the Lord going to do things and your eyes is going to see things that you ain't going to be able to believe. So you will believe the unbelievable. But this is the same guy, Elijah the prophet, that poured the oil on high priest Ahrayah's head and Bar Mitzvah him in the truth when he was 12 years old. Everybody understand that? We have pictures and all of that. We're going to have all these tapes that we're going to show you that. Now, Bivens came, which is Elijah the prophet, to tell Israelites that they were Israelites. Everybody understand that? But what he did not do, and what it was not given to him to do, is to tell each and every Israelite exactly where they fit at in the nation of Israel. Meaning to tell them what tribe they actually belong to. Do everybody understand that? That was given to Chief High Priest and Apostle, High Priest Ahrayah. In order for 12,000 to be sealed, listen for a minute and then clap. In order for 12,000 to be sealed out of each tribe, each of those 12,000 men had to know that they were Ephraimites, that they were Judites, that they were Benjamites, that they were Manassites. All those men had to know who they were. The only way they could know who they were, the Lord God had to come and put a spirit on a man to tell them who they are. And this is the man.
Prophecies are coming to pass. Not just me, Charles, and all the apostles. You are living proof that the prophecies are coming to pass. Because how do you know that you're Israelites? Praise God! 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 Praise God!
Okay, while all of that is interesting and can be seen as having historical value, the portion I wanted to focus on was the fact that Ahrayah had a bar mitzvah under the man one Westers call Abba Bivens. By the way, quick technical note on that, in the captioning, in the subtitle, I spelled his surname Bivens, B-I-V-E-N-S, as that's the spelling most popular among one Westers. However, his actual surname was Bibbins, B-I-B-B-I-N-S. It's my understanding that early next year an interesting book will be coming out which will contain some lesser-known information about the man. I'll try to make a video to discuss it in more detail once the book is out. Getting back to Ahrayah having a bar mitzvah under Abba Bivens, many have heard that story, but few discuss it, which is unfortunate, as it has various historical implications which might be of interest to some. First of all, if we assume Ahrayah is roughly 78 or so years old at this time, then we can date his bar mitzvah to the early 1950s, perhaps 1953, give or take a year. That might help one date Bivens' time with the Commandment Keepers, a subject which will also be explored in the forthcoming book I just alluded to earlier. In other words, if we assume that the relevant bar mitzvah happened when Ahrayah, who was then called Ari, and Bivens were with the Commandment Keepers, then we can say they were already with the Commandment Keepers in the early 1950s. Beyond the chronological aspect or the chronological question, another interesting question would be this. If Bivens and Ahrayah were in favor of having bar mitzvahs, are One West groups having bar mitzvahs today? That is to say, if the founders of the One West stream have this practice, do the various One West splinter groups which descend from them maintain this practice to this day? Now, some might assume the answer is simply no, and probably offer an explanation that as the group grew in knowledge, it shed its earlier rabbinic influences. The reality, however, is that some groups continued the practice. For example, there's currently a video on YouTube from the Diligent Hebrew account titled, quote, House of David, Ban Matazawath, end quote. There actually used to be several videos like that available online. However, now all but one of them have disappeared. Noticing that there is less and less evidence of One West groups holding bar mitzvahs online is actually what inspired me to make this video, as it might be helpful to document this rather than just let it reach a point where it's only passed on via word of mouth. The one video that's still up captures the House of David group holding a bar mitzvah. Some might recall this is the group formed by Mashah when he broke off from the Israeli Church of Universal Practical Knowledge in late 1995 or early 96. It's also the group from which groups like GMS, IUIC, and House of Israel descend. With mentioning that, I'm actually working from fuzzy memory here, so I may be mistaken, but if I recall correctly, when there were more videos of One West groups holding bar mitzvahs, one of them was by the House of Israel group. Now, I might have that mixed up, but if the memory is correct, it would mean House of Israel also has held bar mitzvahs. Again, I might be mistaken, but that's the vague memory I have from the videos that used to be up. Regarding the name Ban Matazawath, that's how One Westers refer to a bar mitzvah in their preferred form of Hebrew, which is known as Lashon Kodash. We can quickly compare the mainstream term to their term now, being that One Westers like to employ the Phoenician script, which they call the Paleo-Hebrew script. I will also employ that script here. Now, the original Aramaic term, Bar Mitzvah, means son of commandment. Actually, quick technical note, due to there being Hebrew loanwords in Jewish Aramaic and Aramaic loanwords in Hebrew, there is a little bit of overlap between the two languages, so one could just as sensibly call this phrase Hebrew rather than Aramaic. Anyway, that aside, One Westers say ban rather than bar because they are reaching for the Hebrew word for son rather than the Aramaic word. However, it can be argued that bar is actually part of Hebrew, as it's employed in the famous Kiss the Sun verse in Psalm 212. So if one interprets that verse as referring to a son, then that verse would be an example of a biblical Hebrew text employing the Hebrew word bar to mean son. That aside, if we turn to the part that reads Taza, the Taza part, that pertains to the way proponents of Lashon Kodash pronounce the Tzadeh, the 18th character of the Hebrew alphabet. And as for the ending, I'm guessing they intended the plural. That is to say, they're trying to say son of commandments rather than just son of commandment. For what it's worth, on multiple occasions in that House of David video I mentioned earlier, they seem to say Ban Matazawah rather than Ban Matazawath, seemingly with a hey rather than a ta at the end. If you do a search for the phrase Ban Matazawath on Google or various social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others, you'll find a bunch of different posts on the subject, many of them going back to members of the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ. That's relevant because the fact that both the ICGJC and the House of David are both holding bar mitzvahs would seem to entail that the practice is part of their common origin. They both go back to the old ICUPK, but they've been separate from one another for more than 23 years. Now, therefore, the fact that both are still holding to the practice seems to mean that the practice was also found with the old One West, which is to say the ICUPK, which was at 1 West 125th Street in Harlem, continued to hold this practice of holding bar mitzvahs, which goes all the way back to Bivens and Ahrayah. This brings us to one last interesting point worth noting. The ICGJC did not settle for only having bar mitzvahs, which are for boys. Rather, the group introduced an innovation into One West history following more liberal forms of Rabbinic Judaism by introducing a corresponding ceremony for girls. While the equivalent for girls is popularly called a bat mitzvah, that's how it's referred to in mainstream parlance, the ICGJC calls it a banath matazawath. It's interesting that One West has historically used the word banath for daughter, as to my knowledge the term is not found in biblical Hebrew, but it still makes sense as the nun appears in the plural, and the word also corresponds to the Arabic bint. So this is an instance where the One West approach to Hebrew would somewhat better reflect the likely Proto-Semitic original behind these terms. I can also color code the consonantal structure of the different terms on the screen, so that way interested viewers can see the corresponding characters in these different scripts. Whatever the case, it's interesting that in the ICGJC, a girl can receive a bat mitzvah, or banath matazawaf as they call it. Just last month, a former member of the ICGJC took the occasion of the bat mitzvah of Tazadakia's daughter as an occasion to go, or as an opportunity to go onto Facebook to polemize against the practice of the ICGJC holding banath matazawafs, to holding bat mitzvahs. The polemic was on the grounds that this practice is not found in antiquity, and she was correct about that. However, for the record, this video should not be taken as an endorsement of either side of the relevant disagreement, rather such as simply being noted for the historical record. With that, I hope others found this subject interesting, and I hope to have more videos in the coming days. God bless.